Welcome to the channel. Here, we dive deep into powerful books and break down their ideas in a calm, thoughtful way. In today's episode, we explore Meeting the Shadow, a deep look into the hidden parts of ourselves, the traits we suppress, and what it means to truly face and integrate them. If you enjoy clear, thought-provoking breakdowns like this, make sure to subscribe and stay with us for more.
Usually when we talk about medical diagnosis, there's this inherent expectation of precision.
Right. It feels very engineering-based, I guess.
Exactly. Like you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line right on the radius bone, and the doctor just points at the film and says, there it is.
Yeah, it's visible, it's categorized.
And it is entirely objective.
Which, that provides a huge sense of security. The human mind just really craves that kind of binary categorization, because it allows us to externalize the problem.
Oh, for sure.
We can look at the broken bone as this object that is totally separate from our core identity.
Right. But the moment you step out of that orthopedic clinic and into the landscape of human behavior, that x-ray machine just shatters.
It really does.
We are suddenly dealing with a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky. And I was thinking about this because of a very specific universal experience.
Okay, what kind of experience?
Well, if you are listening to this right now, I want you to consider a time when you completely shocked yourself.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Like maybe you were in the middle of a heated argument and you said something so surgically cruel, it took the air out of the room.
Yeah.
Or maybe you made this wildly reckless financial or romantic decision that completely subverted your normal values.
Or even just feeling this surge of sudden, uncharacteristic rage in traffic.
Yes. And afterward, in the quiet of your kitchen, you just thought, that wasn't me.
It is, it's honestly one of the most destabilizing moments in the human experience.
It really is.
Because the I that you have spent decades constructing, your conscious identity, it suddenly evaporates. And it feels as though a completely autonomous entity has just taken the wheel of your nervous system.
And the mission for our deep dive today is to explore the architecture of that exact entity. They're unpacking excerpts from a really dense, profound anthology today called Meeting the Shadow, the hidden power of the dark side of human nature.
Edited by Connie Zweig and Jeremiah Abrams.
Right. And the goal here is to dissect the psychological, scientific, and even biological mechanics behind this concept of the shadow, this hidden, exiled side of human nature.
We really want to understand how it operates under the surface to manipulate our relationships, how it literally alters our physical biology. And
what happens when these individual shadows scale up into collective, corporate, or societal toxicity?
Exactly. And to frame the stakes of what we are dealing with here, there's a passage in the text from Alexander Solzhenitsyn that it strips away any illusion that this is merely an academic exercise.
Oh, I love that quote. What does he say?
He writes, "If only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being."
Wow. Yeah, that really establishes the foundational premise of this entire discussion, doesn't it?
It does. We are not analyzing some fringe pathology affecting, bad people out there. We are mapping the unexplored territory within your own psyche.
Which brings it intimately close to home. So let's look at the foundational architecture of this concept. The anthology relies heavily on the groundwork laid by Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, but, it moves quickly past the basics.
Right, because Freud recognized the split in the psyche, but he viewed the unconscious largely as a repository for repressed sexual and aggressive drives.
Like a sort of biological trash bin?
Yes, exactly like a crash bin. But Jung took it much further. He gave the shadow a structural reality.
So it wasn't just leftover debris to him.
No, not at all. He argued that the shadow is created in tandem with the ego. It's the structural counterweight to the conscious personality.
And Jung defined it as the negative side of the personality, right?
Yeah.
The sum of all those unpleasant or socially unacceptable qualities we actively hide.
Right, combined with our insufficiently developed psychological functions. And the anthology uses this brilliant cultural touchstone to illustrate this duality. It brings up Robert Louis Stevenson and the origins of the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Which, as it turns out, wasn't just a clever fiction plot.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Stevenson actually had a vivid, terrifying dream that served as the genesis for the story.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, in his dream, a man swallows a powder and undergoes this drastic, uncontrollable character transformation. He morphs from a kind, philanthropic, highly civilized scientist into a violent, relentless, primitive creature.
Wow.
And Stevenson woke up with this profound realization that humans are not truly one, but truly two.
That narrative resonates across centuries because it is an archetypal truth. I mean, the development of Dr. Jekyll absolutely necessitates the creation of Mr. Hyde.
Right, you can't have one without the other.
Exactly. And the text cites W. Broadjoy, who offers a fantastic framework for understanding this developmental process. He calls the conscious ego the New Year's resolution self.
That is such a great term.
Isn't it? Because when we enter this world as infants, we are essentially undifferentiated potential. We express rage, hunger, joy, and selfishness with equal intensity.
We just want what we want.
Right. But the socialization process begins immediately. We are trained by our parents, our school systems, and our cultural norms that politeness, sharing, and quietness secure love and survival.
So we aggressively cultivate this New Year's resolution self. We build a persona that aligns with what our environment rewards.
And that leads to the critical question, what happens to the psychological energy of the traits we are forced to reject? The anger, the greed, the inappropriate impulses.
Because they don't just vanish, right?
Right. The human psyche operates similarly to a biological immune system. It has to define what is self and what is not self to maintain its integrity.
So the traits that threaten our social survival are actively exiled.
Yes, they are categorized as not self and pushed into the unconscious.
There's a visual metaphor in the text from the poet Robert Bly that captures the burden of this process beautifully. He describes it by saying we spend the first 20 years of our lives deciding what parts of ourselves to stuff into a long bag we drag behind us.
A long bag we drag behind us, yeah.
And then we spend the rest of our lives trying to get those parts out again.
Bly's imagery is so potent because it really captures the weight and the drag of the shadow. I mean, in our highly sanitized, idealistic culture, the acceptable side of the personality becomes increasingly refined.
Right, like the modern professional is constantly optimizing for ethics, emotional intelligence, and public decency.
Exactly. But the psychic substance inside that long bag doesn't just sit there inertly. It ferments. It takes on a life of its own, and it generates an immense amount of resentment about being locked away in the dark.
It makes me think of a kitchen junk drawer.
Oh, that's a good analogy.
You know, you have guests coming over, and your kitchen counter is covered in messy mail, weird batteries, a broken pair of scissors, maybe some overdue bills.
Right.
And to create the illusion of a perfectly put-together life, you just sweep all of it into that one drawer and slam it shut. On the outside, everything looks immaculate.
Your guests think you have your life completely under control.
Right. But every time you add something new to that drawer, the pressure builds. Eventually, the drawer gets stuck off its tracks. Or worse, you pull it just a fraction too far, and the entire drawer collapses, spilling all your hidden chaos onto the floor in front of everyone.
The mechanics of your junk drawer analogy map perfectly onto the clinical reality of the personal unconscious. The contents of that drawer are the exiled fragments of your personality.
But I'm struggling with a structural paradox here.
Okay, what is it?
If building this junk drawer, this long bag, is an unavoidable requirement for growing up and integrating into society, why does the text frame the shadow as something so volatile and dangerous?
That's a fair question.
I mean, if every single functioning human being has to do this just to be civilized, isn't it just standard operating procedure for the brain?
It is standard operating procedure, but the danger lies in the mechanics of repression itself. The text brings in Jungian analyst Edward C. Whitmont to explain this dynamic.
But what does he say?
Well, repression does not neutralize or eliminate a psychological drive. All it does is remove that drive from the supervision of the conscious ego.
Oh, I see.
When you lock those qualities in the bag, you deprive them of light, air, and context. They do not mature alongside the rest of your personality. They remain in an infantile, primitive state.
So they are essentially stunted.
Stunted, but highly energized. And without the moderating influence of the conscious mind, these repressed elements cluster together and form what Jung called autonomous complexes.
Let's drill down into that term. What exactly makes a complex autonomous? How does it operate without our permission?
An autonomous complex is essentially a fragmented subpersonality with its own emotional charge and its own agenda.
Wow.
Because you refuse to integrate it into your conscious identity, it operates outside of your control. Think of it as like a parasitic program running in the background of a computer's operating system.
Oh, that's creepy.
Right. It quietly siphons energy until a specific trigger occurs, perhaps a perceived insult or a moment of high stress. When triggered, the complex bypasses the ego entirely and hijacks the central nervous system.
Oh, so that is the exact mechanism behind the phenomenon we discussed earlier, like suddenly screaming at a partner or engaging in out-of-character self-sabotage.
Exactly. The autonomous complex has temporarily taken the wheel.
That is terrifying because it implies we are sharing our mind with a roommate we absolutely refuse to acknowledge.
It is.
But the anthology introduces a massive pivot here that completely upends the traditional view of the shadow.
Right, the gold.
Yeah. We naturally assume Mr. Hyde is purely evil, but Jung stated that the shadow is 90% pure gold. How can the material we exile out of shame and fear be pure gold?
Well, because the criteria for what goes into the long bag isn't based on objective evil, it's based on what our specific environment deemed unacceptable. The bag contains our malice, certainly, but it also contains our raw vitality and our unlived potential. Imagine a child born with an incredibly sensitive artistic temperament, but they are raised in a family structure that ruthlessly values stoicism, logic, and financial achievement.
Oh, that poor kid.
Right, that child will stuff their creativity, their emotional depth, and their spontaneity into the shadow.
Because expressing those artistic traits threatens their attachment to their parents.
Precisely. They exile their own genius to survive. So the shadow becomes the vault containing the lost depths of the soul.
That's tragic.
It is. The inherent danger isn't the existence of the shadow. The danger is the ego's stubborn refusal to look inside the vault. When the ego rigidly insists, I am only my New Year's resolution self, it creates an unsustainable internal pressure.
And if that pressure isn't dealt with internally, it has to find an external release valve. The shadow demands a stage. And if we refuse to give it one inside our own minds, we are forced to project it outward. Which brings us to the fascinating mechanics of how the shadow sabotages our relationships through a process called projection.
The clinical term for the most potent form of this is projective identification. It is a brilliant, albeit destructive, defense mechanism.
How does it work?
Well, when the ego encounters a tendency within itself that is too painful or shameful to tolerate, it involuntarily transposes that exact tendency onto an external object, usually another person.
So you take a subjective, internal civil war and you convert it into an interpersonal conflict.
Yes. It is an outsourcing of psychological discomfort.
I can't handle the fact that I'm selfish, so I become hyper-fixated on how selfish you are, and I attack you for it.
Exactly. It is significantly less threatening for the fragile ego to battle a dragon out there in the world than to admit the dragon lives inside its own house.
That makes a lot of sense.
And the anthology highlights a classic case study from Edward C. Whitmont that illustrates this perfectly. It involves a middle-aged woman who enters therapy complaining obsessively about her mother-in-law.
Oh, the details of this case are so relatable. The woman tells her therapist that her mother-in-law is domineering. She refuses to listen to anyone else's opinions. She constantly plays the martyr to get attention. And she is just entirely impossible to communicate with.
Right.
And the crucial detail here is that the woman's husband actually agrees with her. He validates her complaint, so it isn't a complete hallucination. The mother-in-law genuinely has difficult traits.
That is a critical requirement for a projection to stick. The unconscious needs a hook to hang the projection on.
What do you mean by a hook?
Well, you cannot successfully project a trait onto someone unless they exhibit at least a microscopic sliver of that behavior.
Oh, okay. So the mother-in-law provides the hook. But the therapy takes a turn when the woman brings in a dream. In the dream, the mother-in-law is acting monstrously, doing all her usual domineering, martyr-like behaviors. But as the dream progresses, the woman realizes, with a sudden sickening horror, that she is the one behaving exactly like the mother-in-law.
Wow.
The dream abruptly dissolves the projection and forces her to see that the traits she despises with such venom in the older woman are actually the dominant features of her own shadow. She is the one who is domineering. She is the one playing the martyr.
And the emotional shock of that realization is profound because it collapses the entire defense structure. The text makes a profound point here. We constantly meet our own shadow in our exaggerated, disproportionate emotional reactions to other people.
Right, the disproportionate part is key.
Exactly. If someone has a flaw and you simply observe it and adjust your behavior, that isn't projection. But if a coworker's minor laziness triggers a week-long, obsessive, seething rage inside you, if you are entirely consumed by how much you loathe this specific trait in them, that excess emotional charge is the dead giveaway.
You aren't reacting to them anymore. You are reacting to your own repressed laziness.
Precisely.
There is a darker, more systemic example of this in the text, told by A.I. Allensby, regarding a conversation he had with Jung himself. Jung described a highly distinguished Quaker man in his community.
Oh, this story is intense.
It really is. This man was the picture of moral perfection. He was upright, constantly engaging in charity, completely identified with his persona of absolute goodness. He flat out refused to acknowledge that he harbored any negative thoughts, flaws, or shadow elements whatsoever.
Which is arguably the most dangerous psychological state a human being can occupy.
Really? Why?
Because when a person achieves total identification with their light persona, the unacknowledged shadow doesn't just disappear. The psychic weight of it has to go somewhere.
And Jung pointed out exactly where that weight landed.
Yeah.
Because the father absolutely refused to carry his own shadow, the unconscious burden bled into the family system. Jung noted that the man's son ultimately became a thief and his daughter became a prostitute. They became the designated scapegoats for the family's pathology. They were literally acting out the repressed darkness that the father refused to integrate.
If we look at this through the lens of family systems theory, it explains so much about generational dysfunction.
Yeah.
The shadow operates collectively within a family unit.
Children pick up on that.
Oh, absolutely. Children are incredibly porous and sensitive to the unconscious energetic currents of their parents. If parents rigidly enforce a sanitized, good vibes-only environment and suppress all conflict and imperfection, they create a massive shadow reservoir.
Wow.
And the child who becomes the black sheep or the identified patient is very often just the one sensitive enough or rebellious enough to metabolize and act out the family's disowned shadow.
That fundamentally reshapes how we should think about parenting and family dynamics. The idea that your refusal to clean out your own psychological junk drawer could force your child to carry that garbage for you is chilling.
It is a heavy responsibility.
But we should clarify that projection isn't exclusively a negative phenomenon, right? The text talks about projecting the gold as well.
Absolutely. This is the concept of the golden shadow. Just as we exile our unacceptable negative traits, we frequently repress our highest potentials if we feel unworthy of them.
So if you possess a latent capacity for immense kindness, leadership, or artistic brilliance, but your conscious ego image is built around being just a normal, unremarkable person, that positive energy still needs an outlet.
Yes. So you project your golden shadow onto an external figure.
And the text points out this is the core architecture of romantic infatuation. When you meet someone and within a week you are convinced they are a flawless mythological deity who holds the key to all your happiness, you aren't actually seeing that person.
Not at all.
You have taken your own unacknowledged potential, your own unlived beauty, and pasted it directly over their face.
Which is why those idealized infatuations almost inevitably lead to catastrophic relationship failures. The external person cannot possibly sustain the impossible weight of your golden shadow forever.
That makes total sense.
Eventually, they make a normal human mistake, the projection shatters, and the infatuation rapidly curdles into bitter resentment. You feel betrayed by them, but in reality, they didn't betray you at all. They just stopped being a blank screen for your projection.
But hold on, if we accept this premise, it feels like we run into a massive ethical wall.
Okay, what do you mean?
If I'm furious at an executive for embezzling pension funds, or if I am genuinely horrified by a violent criminal, is the text implying that my outrage is always just my own unintegrated shadow? Because if everything is just my projection, doesn't that effectively let objective evil off the hook? It sounds like a recipe for moral apathy.
That is a crucial challenge, and the authors of the anthology are meticulous in addressing that exact boundary. They explicitly state that not everything is projection. Objective reality exists.
Okay, phew.
Real malice, corruption, violence, and abuse are objective facts of the world, and they warrant valid, intense moral outrage. Shadow work is not designed to gaslight you into believing that victims of abuse are merely projecting their own darkness onto their abusers.
So how do we separate the objective reality from the psychological projection?
The goal of shadow work is to separate the excess emotional charge from the objective facts. If a politician is lying, the lie is an objective reality that needs to be addressed.
Right.
But if your reaction to that politician involves a consuming, obsessive hatred that dominates your internal life and causes you to lash out at your own family, that excess energy belongs to your shadow. The shadow work asks you to take responsibility for your disproportionate reaction.
Oh, I see.
By owning your own capacity for deceit or manipulation, you withdraw the projection. This actually makes you far more effective at combating objective evil because you can see the perpetrator clearly and strategize rationally rather than flailing blindly at a phantom generated by your own mind.
That makes perfect sense. It's about calibrating the reaction so you're responding to reality, not a mirror. Now, we've explored how the shadow uses other people as a canvas for projection, but the text moves into an area that is arguably even more intimate and inescapable.
Yes, the body.
Right. When the conscious mind completely shuts down the mental avenues for the shadow moves into the physical tissue. Let's examine the somatic shadow, how the body keeps the secret.
This represents a profound intersection of psychology, biology, and psychosomatic medicine. The foundational premise here is that the mind and the body are not a dualistic system. They are functionally identical expressions of the same underlying energy.
And the expert highlighted in this section, John P. Conger, explores the synthesis between Jung's analytical psychology and Wilhelm Reich's biological concept of character armor.
Character armor is such a fascinating concept.
It sounds like a term from a fantasy novel, honestly.
Yeah.
But it is actually a deeply mechanical, physical description of how trauma and repression are stored.
Right. Reich made a revolutionary observation about the physical mechanics of emotion. Emotion isn't just a mental state. It is a biological event involving breath, blood flow, and musculature.
Like when you get scared, your heart literally beats faster.
Exactly. So when a child experiences an intense emotion that is forbidden, let's say they feel an overwhelming urge to cry, but they are in an environment where crying is punished, how do they stop the cry?
They don't just think it away.
No.
Well,
They have to physically use their musculature to block the energetic release. They tighten their jaw, they restrict their diaphragm, they hold their breath, they tense the muscles in their throat.
they physically build a dam against the biological impulse.
Exactly. And when this happens repeatedly over years and decades, that muscular bracing becomes chronic. The fascial networks in the muscular tissue adapt to this constant state of holding. It forms literal armor embedded in the biology.
That's incredible.
The body becomes the ultimate repository of the shadow because it visually and structurally contains the tragic, unspoken history of how the person's spontaneous life energy was suffocated to create their civilized persona.
Your body is a ledger that records every time you betrayed your own impulses.
That's a poetic way to put it, yeah.
You can sit in a therapist's office and construct a beautiful intellectual lie about how well adjusted you are, but your chronic shallow breathing, the permanent tension in your trapezius muscles, your collapsed posture, your biology is screaming the absolute truth of your unintegrated shadow.
The body that hides beneath our clothes blatantly expresses what our conscious mind vehemently denies. And the anthology pushes this concept even further through the work of physician Alfred J. Ziegler and his framework of archetypal medicine.
Right, Ziegler introduces the concept that the symptoms of chronic disease are often the physical manifestations of the unlived life.
The unlived life manifesting as disease.
So when we relentlessly exile parts of our psychological DNA, they don't disappear. They regress and take on somatic substance.
Consider the psychological profile of someone who has spent their entire existence playing the role of the ultimate caregiver and pleaser. They constantly accommodate others, they swallow their anger, and they literally never say no.
So the psychological boundary of no is completely exiled into the shadow.
Yes. And according to Ziegler's framework, the tension of that unlived boundary has to be resolved somewhere. If the mind refuses to hold the boundary, the task drops into the physical tissue.
Wow.
The body might eventually start saying no on their behalf, manifesting as chronic fatigue, profound joint pain, or an autoimmune condition where the body literally attacks its own tissue.
And the clinical approach to this, presented by Arnold Mindell, completely shifts the paradigm of modern medicine. Mindell points out that our default cultural response to illness is to treat the body like an invading, irrational demon.
Right, you get a symptom and your only goal is to eradicate it as quickly as possible with pharmaceuticals.
But Mindell argues that we have to view physical symptoms as a teleological process, meaning they have an inner logic, a wisdom, and a specific goal.
Mindell draws heavily on the metaphors of alchemy for this. In the alchemical tradition, the process of transformation begins with the prima materia, the base, raw, impure substance that must be worked with to create gold.
So the symptom is the prime materia.
Exactly. Mindell posits that the physical symptom, the pain, the rash, the tremor is the prima materia of the psyche. If you just numb it, you abort the alchemical process. The symptom needs to be cooked, it needs to be amplified, explored, and dialogued with to reveal the psychological meaning trapped inside it.
Let's ground this in a mechanical analogy because it makes the concept so clear. Imagine you are driving your car down the highway and suddenly the red check engine light illuminates on the dashboard.
Always a stressful moment.
It's annoying, it's glowing brightly, and it's causing you distress.
Yeah.
Now, you could take a piece of black electrical tape and just cover up the light.
Yeah.
That is the equivalent of taking a painkiller to numb a symptom without investigating the cause. The light is gone. You feel better. But underneath the hood, the engine is still destroying itself. The light is not the problem. The light is the diagnostic messenger.
That is a phenomenal analogy from Mindell's work. The physical symptom is the dashboard warning light for the shadow. If you simply tape over it with suppression, the underlying complex continues to wreak havoc on the system. Mindell suggests that instead of taping over the light, we need to plug in the diagnostic scanner. We need to ask the symptom what system is failing.
But I have to bring up a significant ethical concern here.
Okay, what is it?
When we talk about illness as the unlived life, isn't there a massive danger of slipping into victim blaming? If someone is diagnosed with stage 4 oncology, or if they suffer from debilitating clinical depression, it sounds incredibly harsh to imply that their illness is just a creative attempt by their shadow to get their attention.
Oh, absolutely.
Are we telling people that their cancer is their own fault?
That is the most critical boundary to draw in psychosomatic discussions. And the text relying on analysts like Esther Harding alongside Mindell is exceptionally careful to navigate this. This framework is absolutely not an exercise in victim blaming, and it is in no way a rejection of empirical traditional medical science.
So you don't just try to meditate your tumor away?
Emphatically no. You must still take your car to the mechanic. You treat the engine. You treat the cancer with oncology. You treat the infection with antibiotics.
Okay, that's a relief.
What this framework offers is a radical shift in the psychological relationship to the illness as you're treating it. Normally, we experience severe illness purely as a meaningless random victimization by a hostile universe. Harding and Mindell offer an invitation to ally with the illness psychologically. While the doctors treat the tissue, the patient asks, what unconscious values are demanding to be integrated here? In what ways has my life been rigidly one-sided? It's about utilizing the trauma of the illness as a doorway to individuation. The illness didn't necessarily happen because of your shadow, but the illness can become the very engine that drives you towards psychological wholeness.
It's about refusing to let the suffering go to waste. If you have to go through the fire of the illness anyway, you might as well extract the gold from it.
Beautifully said.
Now, if just one person's unacknowledged shadow is powerful enough to physically manifest as chronic disease or destroy a marriage, what happens when 1,000 of those people walk into the same corporate office every day?
That's where things get really intense.
Or when millions of them log on to the same technological platform?
That brings us to the collective scale. We need to look at the collective shadow work, technology, and the psychology of absolute evil. Right. When individuals congregate into organizations or societies, their personal shadows pool together into a massive collective reservoir. The anthology features a brilliant analysis by Bruce Shackleton regarding the workplace shadow.
How does that work?
Well, the modern corporate environment is an aggressive filtering mechanism. In the pursuit of maximizing shareholder value or climbing the hierarchy, employees are implicitly required to exile massive portions of their humanity. You might have to exile your need for work-life balance, your natural introversion, or even your internal ethical compass.
And the terrifying part is that the organization heavily rewards you for this amputation. The system selects for the most sanitized, relentlessly driven persona.
Yes, the persona is heavily reinforced by promotions and bonuses. But this creates a systemic vulnerability that Shackleton identifies as hubris. The collective corporate ego becomes dangerously inflated with its own success.
And when hubris sets in,
the organization stops learning. It stops listening to dissenting voices. The swollen corporate ego screens out the shadow, but beneath the surface, the unacknowledged pressure of all that exiled ethics and humanity is building to a critical mass. This is the exact mechanism behind the sudden, spectacular implosions we constantly see in the business and political worlds.
It perfectly explains the archetype of the highly moral, upstanding bank executive who is suddenly caught orchestrating a massive embezzlement scheme, or the family values politician caught in a career-ending scandal.
Right.
The public reaction is always, I can't believe it, that behavior is so out of character. But the text is arguing the exact opposite. It is perfectly in character. It is simply the shadow side of their one-sided persona taking the wheel.
It is the inevitable rebalancing of the psychological scales. They pushed their greed or their lust so deep into the shadow that it formed a massive autonomous complex, and when it finally triggered, it completely bypassed their conscious control. And Bill McKibben notes in the text that this exact dynamic scales up to our relationship with technology itself. Our civilization has a relentless, unexamined desire for technological advancement without any limits or reflection. We worship the light of progress and efficiency, but we are pitifully blind to the shadow of that progress.
The environmental devastation, the social alienation.
Exactly. The destructive energy we are unleashing because we refuse to acknowledge the limits of our own wisdom.
Which opens the door to the darkest end of the collective spectrum. The text doesn't shy away from true, absolute evil. It dives into the psychology of malevolence, heavily referencing the work of psychiatrist M. Scott Peck.
Yes, Peck's work is crucial here.
And his definition of evil completely subverts our Hollywood expectations. He argues that genuinely evil people are rarely twirling their mustaches and plotting villainy for the sake of being bad. In fact, they are often incredibly destructive, precisely because they believe they're attempting to destroy evil.
That is the ultimate catastrophic irony of projective identification on a mass scale. Peck points out that evil individuals suffer from a profound sickness, a deep inadequacy or darkness within themselves.
But they can't see it.
Right. Their ego structure is either too weak or too rigidly narcissistic to tolerate the internal guilt and shame. Because they cannot bear to look at the evil within, they misplace the locus of the evil. They project their own sickness outward onto a convenient scapegoat.
Like a minority group, a rival nation, a different political faction.
Yes, and then they attack that scapegoat with absolute righteous fury. They genuinely believe they are doing God's work or purifying the world, when in reality they are desperately trying to murder the reflection of their own internal sickness.
That dynamic is the psychological engine behind every witch hunt, inquisition, and genocide in human history. The perpetrators are always convinced of their own absolute purity. And the anthology provides a chilling, granular look at how this operates within the individual perpetrators of collective evil, referencing Robert J. Liston's monumental study on the Nazi doctors.
Lifton's study is so disturbing, but so necessary.
Lifton sought to understand how highly educated, civilized medical professionals could participate in the daily horrors of the concentration camps and then go home to celebrate Christmas with their families. He identified a psychological mechanism he called doubling.
And it's crucial to understand the clinical difference between doubling and the traditional concept of splitting, right? Because they sound similar but operate very differently.
Oh, good point. Let's clarify that. What is splitting?
Splitting is a traditional psychoanalytic concept often seen in severe trauma. It involves a piece of the self repressing or dissociating it, essentially goes numb and ceases to respond to reality to protect the core psyche from pain. It's a fragmentation.
Okay, so it's a protective shutting down.
Exactly. But doubling is far more sophisticated and insidious. Doubling is a holistic, sustained adaptation. The psyche literally architectures a relatively autonomous, parallel second self.
So they aren't numb, they are fully operational.
Fully operational. This second self is integrated into the environment of the camp. It carries out the continuous, routine bureaucracy of mass murder with cold efficiency. Meanwhile, the original self, the self that loves classical music, that kisses its children goodnight, that considers itself a moral human being, remains completely intact and functional.
The psychological firewall between those two selves must be absolute. They experience zero cognitive dissonance because the good family man and the camp doctor never interact.
That is the ultimate terminal manifestation of the unintegrated shadow. The shadow doesn't just act out sporadically, it becomes a fully realized operational entity, completely severed from the moral constraints of the original ego.
Staring into an abyss that deep brings up a paralyzing question.
Yeah, I bet.
When we look at collective evil operating on a national or global scale, when the shadow infects the culture itself, how do we possibly fight it? If this collective shadow is a heavy objective reality, it feels like we as individuals are entirely powerless. You can't pass a law to make a nation integrate its shadow.
You cannot legislate consciousness. And this is where the text turns to Carl Jung's most profound late-life philosophical writings. Jung lived through the World Wars. He watched the collective shadow engulf Europe.
Oh, right.
And his conclusion was that because the collective shadow is literally composed of millions of individual shadows, the frontier for action, the only true defense against the contagion of mass evil, is the individual psyche.
Wait, if I'm understanding this correctly, the strategy for stopping global fascism or societal collapse is for me to go sit in a room and look at my own junk drawer.
As incredibly counterintuitive and seemingly small as it sounds, yes. Jung argued that rigorous, honest self-examination is the only functional cure for collective madness.
Why?
Because of the mechanics of projection we've been discussing. The shadow never lies, it just is what it is. It is the ego that constantly lies about its real motives and its purity. When you undergo the grueling work of acknowledging your own personal capacity for cruelty, bigotry, greed, and totalitarian thinking, you fundamentally alter your relationship to the world.
You immunize yourself. Because if I know deeply and intimately that the capacity for evil exists inside me, I can no longer be easily manipulated into projecting that evil onto a scapegoat.
Precisely.
A demagogue can't whip me into a frenzy of hating my neighbor because I recognize the monster the demagogue is pointing at is actually just a reflection of myself.
Exactly. By integrating your own shadow, you remove your specific drop of poison from the collective well. You break the circuit of mass projection.
Which means world peace, quite literally, begins with my own internal civil war. That places an immense responsibility on you, the listener, which means we desperately need the tools to do this. How do we actually operationalize this theory?
Right, the practical side.
That brings us to the final and most crucial part of our deep dive, the alchemy of the soul and the practical methods of shadow work.
The term heavily utilized throughout the final chapters is shadow work. And before we discuss the techniques, we must define the objective. The goal of shadow work is emphatically not perfection. It is not an exercise in exercising your demons so you can exist in a state of pure, glowing, enlightened goodness.
So we aren't trying to become saints.
Not at all. Pursuing that kind of purity is a dangerous illusion that merely creates a denser, more reactive shadow. The goal of this work is wholeness.
The anthology includes a fantastic analogy from analyst Barbara Hanna that visualizes this balance. She describes human consciousness as a boat floating on the vast ocean of the unconscious.
Oh, I love the boat analogy.
If we refuse to load any of our shadow into the boat, if we insist on being perfectly light and innocent, we become like a fluffy, insubstantial white cloud. We have no gravity, no substance, and we are easily blown away by the reality of the world.
Right.
But conversely, if we try to take on too much of our shadow all at once, the sheer weight of that darkness will swamp the boat, and we will drown in archetypal anxiety.
It is entirely about the ballast. It is about the capacity to hold the tension of opposites. To be psychologically mature is to consciously accept that you are both profoundly generous and inherently selfish. You are deeply loving and fiercely hateful. Holding those contradictions in conscious awareness without splitting them apart is the essence of integration.
And the text highlights that there is a specific developmental window where this process usually forces its way into our lives, the infamous midlife crisis. Authors Janice Brewy and Anne Brennan provide a fascinating reframe of midlife. They argue that midlife is the archetypal moment when the shadow forcefully demands to be let out of the bag.
If you look at it through a developmental lens, it makes perfect sense. During the first half of life, your primary biological and social task is ego building. You are constructing the persona, establishing a career, finding a mate, building a family.
You are focused on the outside world.
Right. You need that strong, somewhat rigid ego to survive and navigate the external world. But as you approach midlife, the architecture is stable. The ego is finally strong enough to engage the darker material without being destroyed by it.
But what if people resist it?
If the ego stubbornly refuses the call, if it tries to just keep running the same playbook that worked in its 20s, it becomes brittle, sterile, and stuck.
So the classic midlife crisis, the sudden career change, the affair, the sports car, isn't just a cliche panic about aging. It is the unlived life. The neglected shadow, kicking down the door of the psyche and screaming, "It is my turn to live now."
Precisely. If you do not engage the shadow consciously at this juncture, it will erupt destructively to dismantle the life you've built. So the clinical question becomes, how do we engage it consciously?
The anthology offers several highly practical, though decidedly unconventional techniques for this. Let's dissect those techniques. The first one is introduced by poet Robert Bly, and he refers to it as eating the shadow.
Eating the shadow.
This technique involves the playful, deliberate embodiment of the traits you have spent your life disowning. He gives the example of a highly rational, controlled man spending an hour playfully acting like a chaotic witch, or a submissive woman spending an hour acting the part of a domineering patriarch.
The operative word in Bly's technique is playfully. By intentionally acting out a suppressed, primitive, or socially taboo energy within a safe, controlled container, you are stripping the taboo of its power.
Like exposure therapy.
A bit, yeah. You are demonstrating to your own nervous system, I can channel this energy without it destroying my life. It doesn't have to remain locked in the basement. It allows you to safely siphon off the pressurized energy of the complex before it detonates in your real life.
The second technique is even more paradoxical, and it blew the doors off how I think about anxiety. It's called playing the opposites. The core argument here is that trying to change yourself by fighting a symptom almost never works, because fighting the symptom inherently excludes the shadow.
Right. The shadow wants the symptom.
So the advice is, if you feel tense, deliberately make yourself more tense. If you feel guilty, consciously increase the guilt.
It is a radical, paradoxical intervention. Consider the mechanics of anxiety. When panic sets in, your ego is immediately at war with your shadow. The ego commands, calm down, be rational, while the shadow screams, panic, we are in danger.
And fighting it just makes it worse.
By fighting it, you lock the psyche in a paralyzing civil war. By intentionally choosing to amplify the symptom, the ego finally drops the resistance. You align your conscious will with the unconscious drive.
It's the exact mechanical physics of driving a car on black ice.
Oh, that's a brilliant way to look at it.
Yeah, if you hit a patch of ice and your car begins skidding violently to the right, it's your absolute first biological instinct. Your panic response is to jerk the steering wheel hard to the left, away from the skid. But if you do that, your tires lose whatever microtraction they had left, and the car spins completely out of control. The only physical way to regain control of the vehicle is to steer into the skid. You have to turn the wheel in the exact direction you are sliding to allow the tires to catch the road again.
That is a phenomenal mechanical translation of this psychological truth. When you fight the symptom, you are jerking the wheel away from the skid and you spin out into a panic attack. By steering into the symptom, by consciously exaggerating the tension, you eliminate the internal resistance. You take away the shadow's unconscious power because you are now consciously directing the vehicle. The shadow transitions from being a hostile master to a cooperative partner.
But I have to throw a red flag on the play here.
Okay, what's the concern?
Advising someone who is struggling with severe depression to deliberately make themselves more depressed, or telling someone with severe anxiety to steer into the panic, that sounds incredibly counterintuitive and potentially highly destabilizing. Does the text offer any guardrails for this?
It does, and it is a vital caveat. Jungian analyst Karen Signal warns explicitly that deeper is not always better. The door to the shadow should never be ripped off its hinges before the ego is structurally prepared to handle what comes out.
Right.
Psychological defenses exist for a reason. They are load-bearing structures. If you rip off a psychological scab too early, you expose a raw hemorrhaging wound. You can flood the conscious mind with the swamp of the unconscious, leading to psychosis or severe breakdown. These paradoxical techniques require a robust ego and very often the stabilizing container of a trained therapist to ensure you don't sink the boat.
You have to accurately assess if you have enough traction before you steer into the skid.
Exactly.
The third technique is offered by Dina Metzger, and she calls it writing the other. She suggests a journaling exercise where you create a highly detailed fictional character constructed entirely out of the traits you find most repugnant, evil, or annoying in the world. You flesh out their daily routine, their deepest fears, what they eat for breakfast. And then you initiate a dialogue with them. You mentally interact with them as if they were a sibling born from your exact same parents, sharing your exact genetic and environmental background.
It is a grueling exercise in radical empathy. By forcing your mind to construct the internal, emotional logic of the person you despise the most, you are essentially conducting an interview with your own shadow.
It's intense.
You slowly dismantle the illusion that the other is an alien species. You are forced to realize that the villain is a human possibility that resides within your own latent psychological architecture.
It fundamentally forces you to reclaim the projection. You sit across the table from the embodiment of your own darkness, and you have to look them in the eye and admit, oh, we're related.
And that admission is the crux of the alchemical transformation. When you cease hostilities, when you consciously accept the symptom, when you sit down and dialogue with the other, the shadow fundamentally changes form. It ceases to be a monster lurking in the dark, constantly threatening to hijack your life. It becomes an internal advisor.
And crucially, integrating the shadow grants you access to that 90% pure gold.
Yes.
You unlock the creativity, the fierce assertiveness, the wild vitality that you locked away in the bag so many decades ago.
This has been an incredibly demanding, paradigm-shifting journey through the source material.
It really has.
If you are listening to this right now, digesting all of this, the core takeaway is this. The journey of your life is not a quest to become perfectly sanitarily good. It is a quest to become whole. And owning your shadow requires the terrifying courage to surrender your own innocence. You have to admit the villain is inside the house.
But the paradox is, once you invite the villain to the dinner table, the house gets exponentially larger.
To crystallize this entire exploration, we can turn to the poet Rainer Maria Rilke, whose perspective is referenced in the text. Early in his career, Rilke was suffering deeply, and he was advised to undergo psychoanalysis to cure his inner demons and alleviate his suffering.
And what did he say?
He famously refused the treatment, stating, "If my devils are to leave me, I am afraid my angels will take flight as well."
That is a staggering realization.
It frames the ultimate question. So I invite you, the listener, to consider this. Think about the flaw you hate most about yourself, the specific trait you have spent your entire life desperately trying to hide or medicate or cure. What if that very flaw is actually the exact source of your greatest unlived genius? What if your devils are the ones holding the keys to your angels?
That is a profound thought to sit with as we wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into meeting the shadow. The next time you find yourself vibrating with fury at a coworker or consumed by outrage at someone on the news, take a deep breath and look very closely at the specific trait that bothers you the most, because you might just be looking directly into a mirror. And remember that broken medical x-ray machine we talked about at the beginning. It turns out we don't need human behavior to be a clean binary image. The muddy, complex waters of the psyche are exactly where the gold is hidden.